Welcome back to another episode of the Success Times Happiness podcast. I'm your host, Richard Thompson, and today I'm joined by Professor Sean Turnell, an Australian economist whose extraordinary story of surviving nearly 650 days in one of the world's most notorious prisons has captivated the globe. Sean takes us from the light and dark of his childhood imagination to the harsh reality of solitary confinement, sharing how perspective, meaning, and the hero's journey quite literally kept him alive. In this episode, you'll learn what resilience truly looks like when everything is stripped away. Whether you're navigating uncertainty or rebuilding after adversity, this conversation is exactly what you need to hear. All right, let's get into it. Sean Turnell, thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here, mate.
It's an absolute honour to have you as a guest of the podcast. You are known, amongst other things, because you spent near on 650 days in one of the most notorious prisons in the world. It has been almost 3 years to the date of your release. How has that time changed the way you have viewed your ability to manage through the time of incarceration?
I think it's reinforced it, Richard. I think in many ways, mate, by accident, I was quite well disposed to be able to cope with that sort of isolation. Being an academic and that sort of thing, you sort of get used to a life sort of solitary, thinking about things, planning things that you're going to write or teach and all that. So you spend a lot of time in your own head, in other words. So surprisingly, that came to be useful. Likewise, right from when I was sort of, a toddler, obsessed with books and so on. And so after a period of being in the prison, I was able to get books. And so I would read books, ruminate over them, reread them, etc. So, yeah, so I think, mate, basically, I guess, enveloping myself in stories, in ideas, things like that, to keep me away from the circumstances I was in. And the reason why I sort of stress that a little bit is that it's very different to many of my colleagues. Many of my Burmese colleagues, for instance, very devout Buddhists, very practiced in meditation, things like that. So for them, the way they coped was to sort of live life as it was at that moment, to go within oneself. Mine, I think, was a sort of very different mindset, which was more conducive, I think, to somebody my age and background and all that, which was to think about stories
Mm.
and to sort of take myself away from the circumstance rather than sort of, embed myself in it. So, interesting philosophical difference, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in those two circumstances, you're both effectively in flow state. You're separating yourself out from your reality. One is an internal journey. One for you sounds like it's an external fantasy sort of storytelling perspective, but achieving effectively the same outcome is getting away from the actual reality to what you're facing. How has time spent? So 3 years now. How do you reflect on the last 3 years for yourself?
Firstly, great relief, obviously, mate, to be reunited with my family and friends and so on. It's not been without its challenges, etc. But I think above all, a very great appreciation of Australia. We have our problems, etc. But they're really infinitesimal, I think, to many places in the world. So it's been a great joy, I think, in all sorts of little ways. I've been made incredibly welcome here by Australians of all backgrounds and so on, enjoying just our lifestyle, etc., enjoying on the relative calm of our politics and our sort of public realms. Again, I know we have our issues, but, compared to most countries, of course, we are a fantastically organised, compassionate society that achieves great things and, you can have a great life. So, a real sense of gratitude, I
Yeah.
think, in other words, Richard. So I'll never forget the day that I got back, and we have an apartment right in the centre of Sydney, and sort of arrived in the apartment, and then my wife and I went for a walk. It was early in the morning in Sydney. The sun was shining. People were sort of arriving for work and so on, but everything sort of looked just very shiny and clean. The people looked healthy and well. It was just a magical moment, and I've tried to maintain that in the 3 years since. Like everyone else, I have ups and downs and so on. But yeah, for the most part, I sort of just remind myself of just how good life is here,
Mm.
and try to celebrate that as much as I can.
Now, you've been documented to say that, you're obviously a very law-abiding citizen and could do no, did not like to do anything against the grain. I want to know, as a child and into your childhood and your upbringing, what adversity, if any, did you face or did you see other people facing to sort of start building this ability to be resilient?
An interesting question, mate. I think it's sort of secondhand in a way. So my childhood was a very happy one. My parents, created an incredibly loving and stable home. But I think I learnt a lot by this reading obsession that I mentioned. And I grew up like many Australian kids of that era, of the sort of 70s, when I'm reading, reading people like Enid Blyton and sort
Mm.
of stuff. Um, but then that quickly led into stories of World War Two, and not just stories of daring do. I got caught up, for instance, reading a lot of the literature about prisoners of war, the experiences of people in Colditz Castle and the Great Escape and all that. I really got into that genre for a period of time. And so it was funny being in the present, I was able to evoke and to sort of, reach into deep parts of my memory, some of the stories from that. So I think that really helped me a lot. Helped me in practical ways of, how to cope in a sort of imprisoned environment, how to deal with prison guards and so on, how to deal with fellow prisoners, making sure that, you weren't the person who let the side down. That was always very strong. But also, I think, gave me people who I could live up to. So I was sort of, in a sense, powered by other people's stories, and it could give me something to measure my own behaviour against, and to
Mm.
try to live up to. So yeah, so in many ways, mate, my own actual background was one of, I think, sort of working middle class comfort here in Australia. But yeah, I was able to sort of imbibe the experiences of other people just through reading.
What drew you to economics?
My big love was history, but I
Sounds
also
like it.
wanted to. Yeah. So, but I also wanted to help do things. I was very convinced that I could help bring change to the world in the arrogance of youth. Hasten to add, Richard. So I'm not sure I lived up to that, of course. So economics combined a lot of things that I took pleasure in. Intellectually, and I was able to embed in my economics a lot of history. So, in many ways, I was sort of more of an economic historian as an academic as I was sort of an economist itself. So yeah, so economics was a bit of a mix of the love of a sort of historical, institutional approach, but with a bit of intellectual rigor, but also very much informed by doing practical things, hopefully making things better. Um, but again, I in retrospect, I see that much with the sort of that aspect of youth where you feel like you can do anything. Gradually you have the edges knocked off you through time, of course. But yeah, it sort of began that way.
Did you think that ulterior motive, there was a sense of helping and provide, I guess, your expertise to others as a result of your knowledge and study as against the youth element of being impenetrable?
Absolutely, Richard. So my studies and like historical work led me to the realization that for good economic outcomes, institutions really mattered. Things in Australia that we take for granted, the rule of law, basic democracy, human rights, and all that. And you could have good economic policies as well, but you needed those foundations first. So it really come from that sort of accumulating knowledge, and then the opening that I had to Myanmar or Burma, to realize that that country, if I was to help in any way, and I wanted to do that after meeting Burmese people, that I could apply that sort of approach to that country. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. It wasn't only a desire to help, and in this case, it manifested itself in Burma, but it was also this accumulation of knowledge about what the long term story seems to tell us about peace and prosperity.
I find it really interesting, Sean, because my eldest son, who's 12, he is an incredible reader. Okay, and so he reads everything. He loves fantasy, and from what I've understood is that kids in childhood who do lean into fantasy are much less prevalent to get into trouble because they act out, they read and they absorb this whole narrative of the good and the bad, right, and the dark and the light, and that hero's journey. They don't need to act that out in real life because they are in the character or whichever character they wish to play at any given time. I find it so fascinating that sounds like your upbringing. Okay, so you're playing with this light and dark, and then that leads into your fascination with history, and particular, as you said, World War II, where there is this light and dark prevalent in real life, not just in the books. And then I find it even more fascinating that economics, your economic background or your studies and where you go could have easily led to further, staying in the academic system and teaching students, or in internal or macro politics or fiscal politics internally in the country. But it's not. You focus on the light and the dark of the other countries, or that seems to be the lead that you have to put your attention to countries like Myanmar, where the rule of law is not prevalent, where there is this tyranny of military rule and this abhorrent sort of acts that lends itself to you. Do you go that you're in sort of it's appealing to you to help? That'd be fair to say.
That was the driver. And in many ways, immersing yourself in books and so on, like it sounds like your son is doing as well, it sort of creates a background through which your subsequent activity takes place. It's almost as if you have lived out that experience. So, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You probably know, people may have read already that one of the books that I was able to get access to when I was in the prison was Lord of the
Lord of the
Rings.
Rings, yeah.
And I can think of no better book that encapsulates exactly what we've been talking about, the lightness and the darkness, also the subtleties of life,
Mm.
that sometimes things don't work out and that, justice is not done, etc. So it's not simplistic stuff, but at the same time, it is very much about identifying what is good and what is bad and what your responsibilities are and so on. So, yeah, so I think that's absolutely right, mate. And yeah, I only wish your son very well in this journey. I think it's fantastic. Yeah.
Explain to the listeners how you went from knowing Myanmar's problems and the underlying issues in that country to you visiting the country, you being much more deeper in the fabric of the change that country is going to occur.
Yeah, so for a long time I'd studied the country, Richard. So I got to meet some Burmese people when I was at uni and then got gradually involved in their struggle. So when I say Burmese people, they were mostly essentially refugees who had fled Myanmar after the military had taken over. Terrible human rights abuses, etc., had taken place. And I sort of read and understood their struggle. And of course, there's a great interaction between Australia and the Burmese people in World War II. So a lot of things sort of came together to make me very much sympathetic, if you like, in their cause. And then being an economist, I then sort of got pulled into some of the efforts to try and critique the military regime, try and help Burmese people out through the lens of the economy. And so I gradually came to work more and more on Burma until eventually that took over my academic life as well. So I was a professor at Macquarie Uni for a long time, but over time, my all of my research output became Burma related. And that led to a point where I became quite well known within Burma circles as being an economist who worked on the country. So then finally, in 2015, the generals there very surprisingly had an election. And less surprisingly, they completely lost disastrously to Myanmar National League for Democracy, which was headed by someone who I'm sure people have heard of called Aung San Suu Kyi. She'd won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991, very much the head of the democracy movement. So she came into office, and I happened to be in the major city of Burma, Rangoon, on the night of the election. And she said to me after I went to congratulate her and so on, she said, "Look, Sean, you've been working with us for the last decade or so. in your writing, please now come and help us. We're about to assume government. So I ended up then going over to Burma and working alongside her and all those other people who had been fighting for Burmese democracy all of those years. So, yeah, so it was really, in a sense, putting my scholarship, if you like, into action after the opposition had come into office.
Could you see in your all the research and all the time that you spent invested in that country and the economic reforms, what was your position regarding the way that there could be peace for the country? What was the relationship between, I guess, social peace and harmony within the country and I guess democracy generally and the economic reform that you would want to take place?
Yeah, incredibly close, Richard. So when I went over to Burma, it was with the firm conviction that in good economics could come greater peace and prosperity, etc., in the country. So I was always a firm believer of that. And so, in a sense, this was having to put my money where my mouth was.
Mm.
So, yeah, very much part of the story that if Burma could be made prosperous, because I should add, after World War II, it was a country of immense hope. Most people saw it as the one country in Asia that would most quickly catch up to the rich world, to the industrial world. Now, it turned out not to be the case because of this military coup that first took place in the 1960s, but then there were subsequent military coups after that too. But yeah, very much a conviction that if we could get those economic foundations right, we could actually affect peace in the country as well. If people had enough to eat, if there were good institutions, people could get an education, people could, engage in business activity and all the sort of things that, again, we take for granted in a country like Australia, that would really help the country more broadly. So, yeah, very much an interaction between good economics and issues to do with social policy, politics more broadly.
So we have the elected Aung San Suu Kyi there with arguably the greatest economist and professor ready to implement everything that you've worked for and you've prepared for. You're in that moment, you're in that chair. What was the most surprising element of the work for change in the country whilst you were in that position?
I think first up, mate, on the good side was how much we could do. That my position was sort of an odd one. In that I didn't have any official position, but essentially I was the chief advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi, and that gave me incredible scope to look at all sorts of things and to realise all the things I didn't know, and just really the amount of work we had in front of us. So probably the first thing that confronted me was how much good could be done and just how broad a canvas, if you like, that I could paint on. So that was the good side. On the bad side, I think, mate, the thing that really struck me was the degree of opposition, because even though Aung San Suu Kyi and the resistance to military rule had come into place, the military never really went away. So they continued to have a stranglehold over many key institutions, including things like their own budget, for instance. So they could decide what what proportion of Myanmar's income was theirs, and so it meant that it was always a struggle. And as we're trying to reform, we're trying to open the country up, open it to international trade and investment, just change the structure of society that had all been sort of sewn up by the military and enterprises connected to it. But of course, we got incredible resistance from this. So I think confronting, seeing that resistance was probably the most shocking, the most surprising thing, even though I guess I knew it intellectually that it would be coming. But to see it viscerally in front of you, as threats were made and things like that, that that really struck me. And yeah, and probably within the or after about 6 months, I thought, we really do have a struggle on our hands.
Were you leaning on that time on previous historic circumstances or examples in different parts of the world? Vietnam comes to mind in the sense of how do we move this from extreme socialist position to much more closer to the middle, um, and learning from them, or was this? Do you think that the circumstances in terms of how much the generals and the military had control over the budget on a constitutional level, I assume, and other areas that it was becoming more increasingly difficult?
Yes to both, actually, mate. So I spent a lot of time reading, exploring as much as I could, speaking to people, etc., about other country experiences. Vietnam was a very interesting one because there, of course, there hadn't been political change, but there had been dramatic economic change. And we had thought that Vietnam was a very achievable example of where we could go. Then, of course, I looked at Eastern Europe, and the end of the Soviet Union, the reforms there, looked at aspects to do with China, countries all around the world. We actually hope to do better, to be frank, than a lot of those places because we did want to bring about greater political freedom and human rights, etc., as well. So, in a sense, it was sort of economic reform plus plus is what we were trying to do. But yeah, we really looked for good examples elsewhere, tried to be inspired by that, informed by that, etc. But as you allude as well, some of the particular circumstances in Myanmar, the degree of the military's control economically, but as you correctly observe, constitutionally as well. So, for instance, Aung San Suu Kyi and the civilian government at no point had any control over the military or any of the security apparatus. They were constitutionally separate, and at any time, the commander in chief of the armed forces could declare a state of emergency and take over the country. So we had this looming coup all the time, across the whole 5 years I was there. So I was there from 2016 to 2021. Not a week went by without sort of some rumor, fear of a coup, So, yeah, so that was very much there. And it did mean the experience was unique, but as well, an experience that we could draw on the stories of other places as well. But yeah, but that was always limited by the particular circumstances we faced.
Before we get into the fall of the party and what ensues, I'm very excited to have you as a even just as a professor of economics because it intrigues me that there's not too many examples in the world where the extreme left or extreme right on a political or even an economic level is beneficial to the people and the prosperity of any given country. Why do you think they why do you think countries end up or some countries end up in that place despite the fact that evidence suggests otherwise, that it should be closer to the middle?
Yeah, I think it's because of various reasons, mate. Politics, the assumptions and actions of very powerful elites, etc., that keep the fundamental institutions from being put in place. As I mentioned earlier, I am such a firm believer that some of the fundamental institutions we have here, which we sort of give the shorthand of democracy, but beneath that, it's much more important than that. It's much more important than elections, things like that. The basic assumptions we have about the rights of the individual, about property rights, about the dominance of the rule of law,
Mm.
all of those sort of things that I think are just so important, not only for us to live sort of happy lives, but also for businesses to have the degree of certainty they need to grow and develop, for people to come up with good ideas, etc. So I think it all comes down to, are there any reasons why those fundamental institutions don't come into place? Because I think most people around the world, we all have roughly the same objectives. I think humans are not too different from each other, but I think those founding institutions are the things that determine the difference. And if we look around the world, we can see that. It's
Mm.
basically the countries. There are exceptions here and there, but for the most part, there are exceptions that prove the rule that, yeah, these good institutions matter. And sometimes it's a matter of countries get caught in a loop that keep them from getting those institutions. And in some ways, you need a sort of circuit breaker to get there. And I guess what we thought was that, from 2016, we thought we had this circuit breaker,
Yeah.
that this was the time to really get in there and push for the institutions that Myanmar needed. As it turned out, I think the country, I wouldn't say the country wasn't ready because amongst the 55 million people there, 54.9 million were absolutely ready, for these changes. But
Mm.
that remaining 100,000 of this military elite and people connected to them, clearly they were not ready. and they had not given up sufficient power such that this would work, and in fact they used the residual power they had to close things down.
Would you have done anything different, knowing that those 100 odd thousand people obviously were, in their mind, they weren't benefiting from your presence and your what you wanted to have from what the majority of the population wanted. So they wanted to flex, and as a result, the history ensued. But would you have done anything different had you had your time again, Sean?
Such a good question, mate. And I had a lot of time to think about
Yes,
this
indeed.
in the and particularly too, mate, is that I was with the other economic reformers, because we were all enemies of the military,
Yeah.
and so all the rest of it. I think in retrospect, actually, we should have gone faster.
Okay.
So that there's probably, as most listeners would know, there's a big debate in economics, economic development, sort of politics about whether you try and crash through with change. Go cold turkey, different expressions that are shock therapy, various expressions used. Aung San Suu Kyi, who was very much an inclusive sort of person, her approach was to be bold but to try and bring people with her, so she very much tried to bring that elite around the military, tried to get, I guess, into a situation where they would start to identify with progress, So I guess it was sort of a process of, I definitely wouldn't say going slow, but slower than we could have in order to try and bring those elements with us. I think in retrospect, we underestimated just how virulent their opposition was, how ruthless they would be, and how, yeah, I think in retrospect, we needed to go quicker, undermine their economic and business power much more quickly, and in a sense, nullify their opposition,
Mm.
much more quickly than that we ultimately did. And I guess, to make the conditions even more certain for other interests to oppose the military, So I think, yeah, moving quicker, building up vested interests that would oppose a return to military rule, while at the same time undermining particularly the economic power of the military and its allies. I think in retrospect that's what we should have done. Um, but amongst my friends in the prison, amongst the reformers, there's some resistance to that. A few of them said to me, "Oh no, Sean, all that would have happened is that the coup would have taken place
Faster.
earlier.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have had 5 years. We'd have only had a year." So yeah, I think it's really an open question,
Mm.
which I think why it's such a great question, because I think the answer is not certain at all. But as I say, my intuition is that we probably could have gone a bit quicker.
Hey team, just popping in to say thanks for listening. If you're enjoying the episode, please take a second to like or follow the show and share it with a friend. It's the best way to help us grow and keep bringing you more great content. All right, let's get back into it. All right, let's get into this then. It's COVID times and you are quarantining back in Myanmar. In the lead up to that, over those period of years, are you feeling yourself the level of anxiety or the level of risk in what you guys are trying to achieve heighten, or is there a moment before you realize that it's a real problem? Are you thinking to yourself, actually, it is it is getting on the level of dangerous here?
Yeah, so the tensions were definitely rising, Richard. So, as I said, I was there from 2016. In 2020, there was another election, and again, Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy easily won. But the military and its proxy parties disputed the election. There was no basis to it, I hasten to add, but they were saying that the election was rigged. It was sort of, that the Suu Kyi and the others were just tools of foreign interest and all that. So you could definitely feel the whole politics took a negative turn after
Mm.
2020. So you had that underlying tension there. And the political system in Myanmar is a little bit like America, where you have an election and then the new government takes a few months before it's sworn in. So there was that period where Aung San Suu Kyi's party had been re-elected but didn't take up office for the second term. I mean, that they were still in office, of course, but the new term of government wouldn't take place until about 3 months later. And in that period, though, of waiting for the new term of office to take place, the military really ramped up its narrative that the elections had
Was
been
rigged.
stolen,
Mm.
etc. So you could just feel the tension. The rhetoric was starting to build. I was getting a lot of personal threats at that point as well. In retrospect, I think I underestimated them. I sort of dismissed them.
How are those threats received by you?
So the threats were made very openly in newspapers and things like that, very nationalist, pro-military newspapers. They were received by me, I suspect, mate, again, with a little bit too much complacency. I just thought it was, part of the cut and thrust of politics, and being a foreigner close to the story, I was an easy mark, if you like,
Mm.
for that sort of demagoguery. So I think I underestimated how that might translate into actual kinetic activity, in the sense of a coup or something personally against me. So that all started to build, and then as we're getting closer and closer to the period where Aung San Suu Kyi and her government would be re-sworn in on the 1st of February 2021, you could really feel the tension rising. In the last couple of weeks, there were rumours of a coup. So in that last couple of weeks of January 2021, the rumours were swelling about a coup, but we pretty much dismissed them. And when I say we, not just me as a foreigner, but my Burmese colleagues and even people like Aung San Suu Kyi, we all thought that the military had too much to lose because we all thought that they'd actually had things pretty good. I mentioned that they had all this power outside the civilian government
Mm.
because the economy had turned around a lot. Many of them had made a fortune in business. So even though, I mentioned in retrospect, I would have liked the reforms to go deeper and faster, but nonetheless, even what had been done had richly rewarded them and their families. So we really thought that they weren't going to do it. And then, it got right up to that last weekend, the very last week of January, and the rumours were really strong about a coup. But I had a phone call that weekend with Aung San Suu Kyi, and I said to her, what do you think? And she said, no, look, Sean, it's serious and all that. And I'm talking to them. I'm, trying to take the temperature down and all that. But, I think we'll be right. We'll get through it. And I made a deal with her that I would see her in a couple of days to plan out the second term. I'd written up a sort of economic reform document, a new one for this second term of the government, and I was going to come round to her place and have a chat to her about it. But then in the meantime, the coup took place. But
Mm.
yeah, very much a surprise to me, surprise to her, and I think surprise to many people, even though, as I say, there was lots of warning signs and we understood them. But I think we probably underestimated not only the ruthlessness of the military, but how much damage they were willing to uh, bring about to their own country, basically. So yeah, I think that was the principal thing that we missed.
To what level is the Australian Embassy in touch with you about the risks in being there? And why is it that you didn't leave earlier when you potentially could have?
Great questions again, mate. So I was in touch with the Australian Embassy throughout, as I was with the American Embassy and the British Embassy as well. So there was lots of foreign support for reform in Myanmar. So many of the embassies were really concerned, and so I was very much in close contact with them throughout the whole period that I was there, but certainly in this period as well. And the Australian Embassy was certainly very concerned with my welfare. As to why I didn't leave more quickly, because I was arrested 5 days after the coup. So the coup took place on the 1st of February 2021, and I was arrested on the 6th of February 2021. So a mix of things there, Richard. One of them very practical, and that is, as listeners will know, this is deep COVID. So international flights just weren't to be had. There were some charter flights in and out as governments were sort of moving key workers around, but no regular flights at all in and out of Rangoon. As it turned out, seeing the risks and essentially, particularly the American ambassador, I remember him telling me, Sean, you've got to get out. We know your name is on a list, so please get out. So I was trying to get out, and I finally got a flight, a British Airways flight, actually, to London. So even though I would have I really needed to get back to Sydney, but I managed to secure a flight to London, but was arrested in between time. There's also, though, so apart from the COVID and the scheduling issues and all that, to be really honest about it, I'm to blame a little bit as well. Particularly in the first day or so, I dilly dallied around a little bit. And this sort of goes back into a negative aspect, I think, Richard, in terms of the stories that I had of what people had done in the past, in that I didn't want to be disloyal to my Burmese friends. I didn't want to run out. I didn't want to even just the appearance of being a foreigner with great privilege who was able to flee, leaving them to be captured and all that. In the end, I'm not sure that, me being with them made any difference at all. So, to be fair to myself, within a couple of days, I was starting to see the folly of that. But there was that little element as well, a little bit of, even personal pride, maybe a little bit of hubris as well, that oh, in the end, they're not really going to come and arrest me. I think there's a bit of that, a little bit of arrogance on
Mm.
my part that I'll admit to as well. But yeah, but also, yeah, a little bit of sort of probably misplaced feeling of just making sure that they weren't to face the music alone.
And so you do get arrested for effectively being a spy. Talk to me about those first few months of being arrested but not charged.
Yeah, first few months were really awful because I was put just in solitary confinement into something that I used to call the box, even at the time, because it sort of looked like on the inside, like the inside of one of those small shipping containers. I think they call them 20-foot equivalent units, is the technical phrase. Um, but it was sort of a space about that big. No sort of, there was a tiny window there, a little slit window in it where the police and the guards could look through at me. But other than that, it was just a blank room like that with no natural light or anything, no natural air. And I was kept inside this box for over 2 months and interrogated and so on, completely on my own, completely isolated from any news. I had no idea what was going on outside. The guards and the interrogators would come in every day to interrogate me and so on. But they would also try and break my spirit. They'd be coming in to tell me stories that the international community that was totally on board with the coup, that they too were concerned about spies like me, etc. That there was no support, and that their victory in Myanmar was complete, and all the rest of it, which of course wasn't true. But yeah, so easily, I think those first couple of months, great disorientation.
Mm.
At that point too, I wasn't allowed books or any contact from outside. So yeah, those were the worst times, and that's where I had to dig really deep into that, the books of my youth and things like that, just to try and survive that. So yeah, so on that sort of intellectual, spiritual front, I had to do that. The other thing I suppose I should say at this point, mate, was the benefits of doing physical things. And so even though the space was so small, so it took me 8 paces to walk from one wall to the other. But I would pace up and down all the time and count my steps and all that. So, apart from drawing on stories and books and things like that, that sort of very basic physical activity was really important, particularly when at the moments where you felt most anxious, just getting up and moving, I think is really important. And I think it's important, outside of my experience in Myanmar, I think in everyday life. I think
Mm.
when you really feel anxious and you lack agency, like you lack the ability to do anything about it, I think sometimes physical movement can sometimes be really mentally helpful. Likewise, I mentioned that I didn't meditate because I found myself as a older Western guy not really being able to. But in a way, my form of meditation was a little bit of that moving around, touch one
Yes, of
wall,
course.
walk to the other, etc. So in some ways, I think it sort of was physical energy, expending anxiety, but also just letting your mind become less occupied with your circumstance.
In some meditation spheres, they talk about having just enough stimulus to quieten the mind. Because some people who aren't obviously into it, into that sort of level of meditation. They can't sit because then they just sit and just in a still room and do nothing. Then their brain takes them on, it's not peaceful, let's say. But whether it's
Yeah,
sitting on a train and seeing the landscape go past, or walking, as you say, or in the shower, or driving,
yeah,
you sort of it is just enough stimulus to quieten the mind's eye, is for you to be able to be in that meditative state. So it sounds like whilst you preface that by saying you weren't Buddhist and you didn't know how to meditate, it sounds like you're absolutely doing it on a daily basis.
yeah. Exactly, mate. I think in a roundabout way, I sort of found myself on that path. I think
So I'm
that's a good
intrigued in
point.
this part of the chapter, Sean, because you don't have any contact with the outside world, no other prisoners. The only contact you have is with these guards. You don't have access to sunlight. You don't have any access to clocks or time or days or nights, or it would be incredibly disorientating. And this is a mid-50-year-old Australian professor in economics now in this scenario. How much is reality? Because it's so. I think there is an element of when you've been interviewed over the last 3 years, and your book is incredible. There is an element of, and then maybe a subconscious position of, well, we know that it all ended up okay for you. We know that there was an end to it, but 3 months in the box, that is an enormous amount of time to sit with your own thoughts without knowing that this could be indefinite. You could be killed the next day. You had zero certainty. How are you dealing with that emotionally?
It's an interesting question, right? And dealing with it in the ways that I mentioned. Try and you're right about the all pervasive uncertainty. Trying to see myself in a bigger picture, like trying to pull back a little bit. And again, I don't want to sort of over exaggerate, but I don't want to under exaggerate as well. That I really did see my position in terms of the things that I read, and that this was a big story, and that I was playing a part in that story. And if I could think about it that way,
You saw yourself as a character in a book.
absolutely. Yeah, and that
Yeah,
this would be the defining event of my life, and that I
that's
had to get
amazing.
through it. I had to behave well. I think was really important. Like seeing myself almost outside myself, if you like. But the uncertainty certainly was very much there. On the upside, mate, the uncertainty was also there was a positive aspect as well because, as you know, I ended up spending nearly 2 years there. I think if I'd known that at the beginning, I would have been crushed. But I thought through much of that early period, I always had this idea that they might just send me home,
Mm,
that they might just deport me. So it took a long time for the sort of despair to set in, that I would be there for a long time because I always thought that, okay, they've made their point, and part of their point was to frighten foreigners away, because that the military didn't want foreign interference in this coup. And so I thought, well, okay, you've done all this, you've sent the message to me and other people, so maybe you'll just send me home. So I had that all the way through, that early period, as well as all the horror. So I think, mate, in many ways, the worst aspect then came when they actually came to charge me, and as you identified, basically with being a spy, with breaching the Official Secrets Act and all that. And because I was charged alongside Aung San Suu Kyi and the other ministers, I realised then that the trial was going to go for a long time, a year or so. So I think it was at that moment that things were at their worst. You're also right, though, in bringing up the issue that I might be killed, etc. Because I did have that thought every now and then that they might try something. I also had the thought, again, as you say, mate, I was in my mid 50s to late 50s at that time. I thought, well, what if the stress just means I have a heart attack and I just die here?
mm,
And but again, to place the story of the narrative in its centre place, I then worried about what they could say. Like
yeah.
I didn't want to die there and not be able to tell the story, not to be able to tell the truth. And yeah, so that was sort of the worst times, I think, and thinking about that, what would happen if they killed me or if I just died, and what would they say? What would my wife and family understand of what had happened to me? So
Mm.
that that was probably the biggest concern of all, I think.
It provides me with a lot of optimism to know that effectively you're choosing the hero's journey figuratively, and now almost you now are obviously the author of the book, so you actually the case. Do you think adopting the hero's journey when you are dealing with something so challenging, because the purpose of this show, obviously, other than speaking with people who have achieved enormous success, it's also for people on the path of finding happiness. Now, you not everyone, I hope there's not many people that are going to find themselves in your scenario, but there are invariably people are going to find themselves where the floor is just pulled out from underneath them, and they're going to find themselves in their own scenario of being in the box for months without any certainty. In specific experience, what would be your takeaways? What would be your advice to people in their own box?
Absolutely, Richard. And again, I think you've hit upon the central issue, which is that, and I know it's trite to say things like, we have no control about what happens to us, but we have control about how we react to that. Again, easy to say because circumstances that come to people, worse than mine, and particularly, issues to do with health and all the sorts of things in life that can go wrong. But nonetheless, trite or cliche or not, it's also true that we do have power over our response. And I think choosing the narrative, I think is absolutely right, Richard. And again, for me, it was very explicit, very self-conscious that I was living a story and that I could determine that story. Yeah, likewise, could do nothing about the external events happening to me, but I could determine what how I reacted to them, and telling the story as well, which was absolutely critical. So I mentioned like thinking about books, the pacing, and all that, but thinking about what was happening to me was critically important, and thinking how to write the story. So, but by the time I got towards the end of the 2 years, many of the stories that then became in the book and all that, I had fully worked out, even to the extent of where the commas would place.
Yeah,
So and I would recite over and over again. There's a couple of chapters of that book that are absolutely locked into my mind, word for word. And when I finally got back to Australia, I remember just saying to my wife, "Oh, darling, quick, give me a pad. I've got to write." And just recording what I've
kept
been
going.
memorizing
Yeah.
for months. Yeah.
Were you a reader of or follower of Viktor Frankl's work before you went over?
Not before, Richard,
Yeah,
no. So
interesting.
I heard of him, but not before. I found it greatly enriching since, of course.
Mm.
But no, I didn't know.
Because he obviously shares the same view, and I think there's a quote there that is, "Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." And so, in the man's search for meaning, there's so many commonality and common threads between his story and yours, and that's where you can have everything stripped away from you and have no certainty, but you both landed on this place of the way you perceive the scenario is everything.
Yep. Yeah, so I didn't have access to him, mate. I did well, one of the most, I've mentioned Lord of the Rings. One of the books I was able to get access to is a wonderful book by the very well-known Australian Clive James, who wrote a book called Cultural Amnesia that sort of celebrated many of similar sorts of people that in the 20th century who suffered all sorts of terrible things under the Nazis, under the Soviet Union, and so on, and stories of them and how they coped and what they wrote and all that. So that was really informative and inspiring to me as well. But yeah, I wish I had direct access to Frankel because I think that would have even more ammunition. But certainly since coming out, I've identified exactly what you've said and looked at his work and thought, oh wow, this is sort of unconsciously I was sort of tending to his direction.
Now, going into the trial, were you surprised at any of that year in the judicial system of Myanmar, or was it as farcical as you can only imagine?
Yeah, a complete fast from beginning to end,
Yeah,
and I expected nothing less.
yeah,
So Myanmar is one of those places. If you're charged with anything, you will be found guilty.
Yeah.
But the courts, everything about them, pure theatre. Theatre to the extent sometimes it's even funny, when witnesses appear and give evidence to the court that you tried to recruit them as a spy and all the rest of it, when, you've never seen
Never
the
met them
person.
before.
I remember absolutely. There was one moment where my lawyer, who was just wonderful, actually said to one of the people who had accused me of trying to recruit him as a spy, he said to him, "Do you speak English?" And this person said no. He said, "Well, at the time that you're claiming Sean approached you to be a spy, he couldn't speak Burmese either. So what language were you using?" So it didn't make any difference.
How does one be a defense lawyer in a country like that? Did you get to speak to your own representation about the challenges?
With great care, which is why he was a marvelous person. But it's the one, some of his actions were areas where I couldn't go into too much detail and still can't, frankly, mate, just in case it endangers him. But yeah, so some of those people, though, were just fantastic, within a system that was as awful as that. And also, Richard, to be on one thing I should say as well, sometimes some of the prison guards were really good too, because most Burmese people, even prison guards and so on, they know the score. They know how evil this regime is. They don't support it. And many of them were able to signal, look, we're really sorry what's happened. This is not us.
Listening to your previous interviews and you talk about the softness of the guards, that seems to be at large at odds, let's say, with World War II and the small elements of research that I've been able to do and readings, particularly of Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, where that talks about how you can get law-abiding, upstanding citizens, police in Germany, who in 3 months later become mass murderers for the regime. But your anecdotes, you give sound through in your book as well, and as well as the interviews, you have a lot of time and care for these guards to the point where you were sharing, you'd be getting care packages from home, and you'd be sharing that with them and showing them photos and images of what it's like back in Australia. Where did that come from for
Yeah,
you? Because it could be so easy to have this resentment. But is that the Burmese culture? Is that the people?
it is. And it's one of the great tragedies of the country, which is that these are the kindest, gentlest people it's possible to imagine, and that they've lived under these military regimes for more than half a century is just so awful, But because you're absolutely right, these are people whose natural response is to be incredibly generous and compassionate and so on. So yeah, and I often found myself, feeling sorry for them. These are the prison guards because
Mm.
invariably they were incredibly poor, had very few options in life, lived in dreadful physical circumstances. In fact, many of them lived in sort of humpies, sort of within the prison. So their situation was often awful. There were some really bad prison guards, and who sort of expressed some hostility to me, but for the most part, treated my Burmese colleagues much worse. But yeah, but I think sort of, I could be compassionate to them because I recognise that this wasn't their doing at all, and they were victims of Burma's circumstances as much as I was.
The sentencing piece was interesting for me, learning that you were told at the beginning of the trial, 12 months before, that you'd have a time to speak on sentencing, not whether or not you'd be found guilty or not, but the presumption is that you'll be guilty, and on sentencing you can have your 3 minutes. I think was given to you. You would have spent a lot of time articulating in your own mind what you're going to say.
I absolutely did. Richard, so the trial lasted a year, where I was forbidden to speak, and I had to sit there and listen to this nonsense for an entire year. And I very carefully then thought of what to say in the 3 minutes that I was going to be allocated. And of course, I wasn't allowed a pen or paper or anything like that, so I had to memorize what I was going to say. And on that final day of sentencing, and we were given the opportunity to talk, I stood up, got 90 seconds in, and was told to sit down again. and,
Oh,
and
God.
went to then. So it's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, and so then you were sentenced to 4 years in
hmm
in prison, and then moved to at that stage, you were already in the out of the box and into the insane prison system. And talk to me about the conditions in that correctional facility.
Things were better in the main prison, which, as you rightly say, is called insane prison. They were slightly better in the sense I was with other people, and in particular, I was with the key
Yes.
economic reformers. We were all put in sort of adjacent cells. We're also with all sorts of other prisoners, murderers, drug traffickers, etc., as well. And remarkably got on well with some of those people too. um, and so things were better on that front. But yeah, the physical conditions just awful. The cells were built under the old days of the British Empire, so over 100 years ago. They were concrete things, hideously. I mean, hygiene. The lack of hygiene doesn't even begin to describe it. Of these old squat toilets that were in place, rusty old iron bars. The prison cells was the sort of things that you would see in a movie. They looked medieval,
Mm.
and the jail itself looked medieval. Again, it was very old and all the rest of it. So, and the food was terrible. It was delivered to us in buckets. So, yeah, so the physical conditions of the prison were awful. The cells were also open to the elements, and I'm sure many people would know that Burma, Myanmar, is right in the middle of Southeast Asia. It's monsoonal. It's hot all the time. And the cells being open to the elements just meant that the temperature was dreadful. The rain would come in, though, when it started to rain. And what would also come into the cells were all sorts of creatures, from rats to giant centipedes to scorpions, spiders, ants, just about anything. And you sort of got used to that after a while, of just waking up with ants crawling all over you, things like that. So the physical environment was awful. But on the upside, we were allowed out of the cells a couple of hours a day, and so we could talk and share experiences and help each other out. So yeah, but yeah, I certainly wouldn't recommend insane prison as a place to stay.
And you befriended one inmate in particular that assisted you in those early days?
That's right, wonderful man called Kin Mong Shui, who had fought against the military when they took over. The military really hated him. He was wonderful to me. He was so incredibly generous. In fact, I wouldn't have survived without him because, as a 58-year-old Australian academic, and my love of reading and all that, but all of that, of course, tells us that I'm not a man of great practical abilities. To me, camping is confronting, and so, yeah, just terrible, just, very basic practical suffering. But Kin Mong Shui helped me out magically, with food, with everything. Just a marvelous man. Would defend me against particularly unkind prison guards, things like that. Just a wonderful character. And I hope you don't mind, Nate. I might go to the what happened to him, because he was later murdered in the prison
Mm.
by some of those bad prison guards that I mentioned, because he would stand up for himself, but he would stand up for others as well. As I mentioned, they particularly disliked him, and they basically beat and kicked him to death. Uh, probably about 6 months after I'd sort of been moved to a different part of the prison, and so I'd sort of lost touch with him, and then heard later that he'd been murdered.
How was your relationship with your own ultimate demise in that scenario, throughout that whole ordeal? Because I'd imagine part of you is the same kid or the same uni student that is unpenetrable and thinking that I'm a foreign national. They're surely not going to kill me. But then you've also got the same military presence that you didn't think would overthrow the government, but did, and has no problem killing their own. Where were you with that uncertainty, after sentencing? After you know that you got 4 years, at least you have a date now, right? You know you're going to be you're fighting for survival to get to that date. How are you sitting with your own risk of that?
By then, I'd been in the prison for 2 years, or nearly 2 years, and yeah, again, a real low point, that, because I would have had to have served 2 more years, and I really doubted that I would be able to do it. Again, not so much in spirit, but I thought even physically. So those fears that I'd mentioned about, just dying of natural causes through suffering and so on, and bad food and a lack of medical care and all that. But against that though too, I'd still maintained a hope that once convicted, they would then just deport me. So I had that idea as well. Um, but they actually, beyond sentencing, kept me another 3 months. And I think those 3 months, particularly towards the end of that, that was probably the worst of all, to be honest, even worse than the box. Because, 3 months after sentencing, I still hadn't been deported or anything. And I really thought, okay, I'm just going to have to go right to the end of this and just hope I can get through it. So yeah, so that uncertainty about that, but juxtaposed with the certainty of how long the sentence remained, yeah, that was pretty much a low point.
How much hope were you being given by the embassy and by the Australian government at that time about your release post sentencing?
I got incredible support from the embassy. And you mentioned earlier, Richard, the delivery of these sort of care packages of food and books and things like that, which would arrive every few weeks. So much support like that. But the jail, all the jail process would never allow the Australian embassy any access to me in person. So I never once got to meet them. I was able to talk to them on the phone, and through them, I was able to talk to my wife on the phone every couple of weeks as well. But yeah, I wasn't able to physically access them, but their physical support for me was incredible. And that I'll be grateful to forever. They even allowed my wife to smuggle the fruitcakes that she would make in the diplomatic pouch that went from Canberra to Rangoon. So all of that was great. And meanwhile, behind the scenes, of course, they're advocating for my release all the way through and advocating for proper procedure and all of that. When it come to though how long the sentence would be, they were pretty much in the dark as well. So they weren't really able to offer me any particular assurance on that front because they just didn't know. And they were very honest with me throughout as well, which was good actually because it meant that I didn't get false hope. Yeah, so even though they were of great physical support to me, they weren't really able to, just because they couldn't, offer any sort of hope with respect to release, beyond saying that they were doing all that they can,
Mm.
and that also that other people around the world were marshalling. So that actually gave me a lift because that they would tell me things like that. That then Prince Charles had been in touch and was anxious to do that all that he could. That resolutions were being passed in the Australian Parliament, in the US Congress, and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, so just conveying that actually greatly lifted my spirits. But yeah, with respect to the sentence itself, that they were sort of just as much in the dark.
On a personal note, it was quite touching for me to read about how elevated your mood was after having 15 minutes on the telephone with your wife at every couple of weeks, and it took you days to come off that high. Talk to me about the importance of that.
Yeah, critically important. So roughly once every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I was able to talk to her, my wife, and yeah, I would just get such a lift, and it was only 20 minutes, and you try and cram as much possible into that period. I try to read between the lines, of course, because she had to be careful what she said, and likewise, I had to be careful what I said to her. And of course, because of all this was unexpected, we didn't work out a code or anything like that, but sometimes we're able to draw on experiences that only we would know about to sort of send messages to each other, things like that. Um, but yeah, just hearing the voice gave me such a lift. And even though, yeah, it would only be sort of 20 minutes, I would come away feeling just elated. And it took a day or two for that elation to wear off. And then, just be sort of ready for the next conversation. So yeah, that was all very, very important.
How does she reflect on the time? Because as I understand it, whilst you were in the box early days, there was no contact with them or with the embassy or obviously your wife. How is she dealing with that? How does she reflect in that period of time?
Yeah, so very hard for her. In many ways, I think a situation like mine is even harder for her than it is for me because for me, I know what's happening, whereas
Mm.
my loved ones, my dad, my sister, my wife, all had to imagine. the terrible things that might be going on. So, and sometimes worse than what was actually going on. So, and all the uncertainty just bore down heavily on them, as well as all the, it's just the practical things, because it's just hard to live a normal life while, that's going on. So, yeah, so she had to cope with all of that and did so magnificently. She's a very practical person, and a sort of person who just gets on with things. And she was born in Vietnam, and she has that sort of toughness, if I can say, that people from that country have. So I think she doesn't spend a lot of time reflecting on it. I think for her, she would, again, she's a very practical person who, yeah, just sort of get on with things. Is her sort of approach, and
Yeah.
and that remains the case to the present day.
Tell me about when you first get the news that you're going to get released and get back home. Walk me through those couple of days.
So it came at an amazing moment because I was at that really low ebb, as I mentioned earlier, 3 months after sentencing, no hope of release. I'd had a phone call with my wife the day before where we both agreed that we just couldn't foresee when I would be released at all. And so I was feeling pretty low. And then suddenly one morning, a prison guard came to me and said, "Sean, good news, you're going home." And I was just completely stunned, and I didn't know what to do. It was one of those moments where everything I'd hoped for 2 years was suddenly there in front of me. I remember getting up, well, asking him first just to make sure that he wasn't joking, because he was a bit of a joker, this guy. He was one of the nicer prison guards. And I said, "Look, please, you can't joke with something like this." And he said, "No, no, no, it's real, but you've got to get ready." And I think I had 10 minutes to pack up my stuff, and I sort of got up, sat back down again, got up again, looked at some things, and thought, "Do I bring these awful clothes home? Are there any books that I should bring home, or just what to do?" But eventually, sort of, just got things in place, and then was sort of escorted to the gate of the prison. I was still worried even to that point, though. So there's a bit of anxiety as well, because one of the favourite tricks that the Burmese military have is that they sometimes release prisoners and then rearrest them upon
Mm,
release, and charge them with
for a
something
different
else.
charge. Yep.
And I heard about this, so I thought, oh God, please let this not be the case. But thankfully, I was put on a bus, and that bus, a fully contained bus, I hasten to add, not a regular bus, which took us to the airport, where I met the Australian ambassador for the first time. There was a new ambassador had been appointed in the meantime, and just totally surreal, because at the airport were sort of many of the ambassadors from around the world, and we were sort of in the sort of first class lounge at Yangon International Airport, and just completely surreal. And put on a plane, first to Bangkok, and then from Bangkok to Melbourne, and then the Prime Minister left his private jet the Prime Ministerial jet, I should say, to take me from Melbourne back to Sydney. So, and all of that took place within 24 hours. So, literally within 24 hours, I went from being in a
In a
squalid
cell.
concrete cell without hope to sitting on the Prime Minister's plane and being asked by an RAAF steward, would I like some champagne with my meal? So
How
it
does
was
how do you
somewhat
reconcile? How do you
close to never
reconcile with that?
very difficult. Except I suppose the thing that allowed reconciliation was just pure joy.
Yeah, sure.
Unadulterated, uncomplicated joy. So yeah.
Did you have to make sure you weren't dreaming? Because your anecdotes about dreaming during incarceration and back home fascinate me as well. But I would imagine that sort of how fast that all happened, you'd have to make sure that this is legit.
Absolutely, mate. So think about that all the time, but sort of understood that it was real. But that then led into the other thing, which is the whole issue of dreaming. Because when I was in the prison, I used to have dreams of being released, and then return to the prison for some reason. And at home, I'd almost have the opposite dream. I would have a dream that I was back there in the prison, and that I was about to be released, but that something went wrong, some little administrative fault to a form or something like that. So in some ways, the sort of lack of belief in or or doubt, that I was being released would happen unconsciously. But yeah, consciously, I think it was fairly okay, but surreal. But yeah, it's sort of in the dreamlike state. I think that sort of thing came to the fore.
I'd imagine resilience has taken on a new meaning for you now, looking back at what you were able to endure, something that you probably had only had read up until now. How do you feel about yourself and your ability to have endured that? What is your relationship with yourself now, having experienced that?
It's interesting. I don't think it's any different, to be honest. And people often come up to me and like since the book and all that and say, I don't know how you could cope. I wouldn't be able to cope. And I usually push back on that,
Mm.
which, to be honest, because I think we all do. And we have things thrown at us. And, it gets back to that issue of how you respond and all that. And my honest belief is that most people do respond realistically to their situation. They make the best of what they can, and so, yeah, so I think it doesn't really change that much. I think their attitude to myself. I mentioned earlier, that I think I'm a bit lucky that I did have that background of being a reader, being someone very comfortable, solitary, and in own stories, and being an academic sort of, just added to that, if you like, because it is very much a solitary sort of thing often. So yeah, so I think, and also I know that I don't think I was heroic at all. I think I just got by and I got things done. But I think in doing that, it was just a rational response that I think most people would do. So I think my attitude to myself is really hasn't changed at all, really. And probably a code of the people might not want to hear. I don't think I'm any wiser or anything. So, so for instance, I still get anxious about a deadline for something or being late. I still get frustrated when the train gets delayed, and I still carry on and in hysterically at the moment that I can't unwrap something, or so the everyday frustrations mean that I respond as badly.
Still exist to the man that
Precisely.
survived it. Oh, that's humbling for all of us to know that, I guess, that you still get frustrated. Oh dear. What do you think your role now is I guess in broader life? Because you went into Myanmar for the greater good, and from what I understand, you're not necessarily welcome back to that country, but
Yeah.
but now you've got an amazing platform to be able to do a level of good that probably not something that you contemplated.
Yeah, so I guess my number one sort of objective at the moment, in the narrow sense, is to try and help my Burmese friends. People who are still in the prison, people more broadly that are just suffering, etc. So trying to make things better, trying to help the people of Burma inside the country, outside the country. That's probably number one. But then, secondly, I think, to be honest, Richard, doing things like we're doing at the moment, um, and trying to get the message across to people that that terrible things happen, that you can respond well. I think I have a responsibility, and this is why I kicked off things in the way that I did, to say just how good things are in Australia, in really fundamental ways, our political system, our institutions, but also just everyday people. I can't really express enough the everyday kindnesses, etc., that I've received. And so I sometimes think, as a society, we need to be a little bit easier on each other and to recognize just what a great society we've constructed. And it's pretty okay, despite everything. So, yeah, so I feel a little bit of responsibility to express that good news, if you like.
For sure, for sure. Now, Sean, from everything you have endured and your incredible story, what would be one one thing that you'd want everyone listening, everyone reading your book to take away and implement in their own lives?
Again, I think it comes down to that issue of having control over your own narrative, of when things happen, stepping back, seeing your life in totality. because I think that really helps in how you respond. If you do take the long view and the view of how you will be viewed by your family, by your friends, and so on, that your response to things really matters, and that if you do respond well and generously, I think, then other people and events will tend to sort of go your way as well. So I think that's probably the major thing. But understanding, as I mentioned earlier, that sometimes that is very difficult, and mostly I won't be able to do it as well. But yeah, I think that would be the major thing.
Looking back, Sean, I find it interesting that for someone who is so law-abiding and so conservative in up until this point, there's a pivotal moment whereby you could have made the decision to go home before as soon as the coup started and jumped in the plane. But I feel like subconsciously, after all these fantasy books and the hero's journey, you've almost subconsciously said, I'm going to stay because this is where I need to be. My final question, Sean, is would you have left if you knew what you had to endure? Would you have done things differently?
Wow. Richard, so many of your questions would be good, but that one takes the cake. Really interesting. And I've asked myself, I've tried to be really honest with myself about that. Yeah, because there's just so many things that are different now because of these awful events, but that opened the door to
Mm,
so many good things. Whether it be, my personal reflections and things like that, but doing things like this, writing the book, meeting so many interesting people, telling the story, etc. I suspect I would probably do exactly the same again.
I love
Being
that.
really honest about it. It's a really interesting question that I put to myself, and I'm the only person who can answer it, but I'm the only person who can. Um, yeah, I try to ask that question of myself bluntly as possible. So I'm really glad you you asked me. But I suspect deep in my heart that I would probably do things exactly the same.
Sean, before we go, 5 very, very quick questions, quick fire answers. What does success mean to you?
To be a good person and to be seen as being a good person for selfish reasons, but also to help others.
What does happiness mean to you?
I think a good mental, spiritual state, by which I mean sort of being in harmony with your loved ones, I think, more than anything else.
What does a usual morning routine look like for Sean Turnell?
Getting up very early in the morning with really strong coffee and reading the newspaper.
What time were we talking?
4:30.
Very good. What would be one piece of advice you would give to your younger self that you'd put on a billboard for everyone to see?
Read even more.
I
So
love-
make sure that I'd read Viktor Frankl.
yeah. Well, don't think you needed it, but that's okay. And then finally, through all everyone you've met and anyone in your life that you know, who would you recommend would be a great guest for our show next?
So it has to be somebody still alive, right?
Correct.
So I think there's a wonderful Australian politician who is in the New South Wales Parliament called Janelle Saffin. And Janelle's one of those people, and if she came on the program, she wouldn't be political. She's sort of been in the federal parliament, she's been in the state parliament, but she's one of those people who very quietly gets a huge amount done, particularly through Southeast Asia. So she was a great friend, for instance, of the whole democracy movement in Timor, the whole democracy movement in Myanmar and other places. And she just does magical things behind the scenes,
Mm,
but many people don't know what she does. So yeah, Janelle Saffin,
okay.
who lives just over the border in Lismore, so not too far away from Queensland.
Nice. Yeah, yeah.
I'd recommend her. Yeah,
Wonderful. Sean Turnell, you've been so generous with your time. It's an absolute honor this year to have you as a guest of the show, and I thank you so much.
thank you so much, Richard. I really enjoyed it, mate. And even though I said it at the time multiple times, your questions were excellent. So I had a good time.
I appreciate it. All right. Thank you so much, mate.
Thanks very much, mate.
That was another episode of the Success Times Happiness podcast. Next time you're lost in a fantasy novel, turn to the person next to you and tell them all about the show. It really means a lot. A huge thank you to Sean. for sharing his powerful story with us with such honesty and humility. If today's conversation inspired you, please subscribe, leave a comment, or share it with someone who needs to hear it. It's the only way we grow, and we really, really appreciate it. Until next time, peace.